Welcome to the Geekscape Book Club, and I'm very excited, not just because of the usual excitement to be joined by my pal Eric Connor. I am also excited for, I believe, only the second time we're having one of the authors of one of the works we're discussing, J.M. DeMatteis. Thank you so much for joining us, taking the time to chat today.
Happy to do it.
So we do want to start off talking about Kraven's Last Hunt, and I know there's so much more to talk to you about, and we'll touch on some other things. This is sort of when this came out, I was 11, and it definitely blew me away.
So was I. I was a prodigy.
You wanted to show up that Jim Shooter story about him writing.
That's right. I beat him by a year. Yeah. No, I think he was 12 when he started, actually.
Oh, you know what? I think you're right. Yeah. You're like, but I killed Kraven when I was 11.
I have a 12-year-old. I gotta go talk to him and get him up his game.
He's an
that was the thing that I was thinking of, is that I have an 8-year-old son named Felix, and I was thinking like, oh my God, this would be so over his head. I'm like, this had to be over my head. But it's just, there's so much more to it than, I think that era of Amazing Spider-Man, all the Spider-Man titles are personally my favorite. Right when I started reading was right when he got the black costume. But this seems, at least for that era, unprecedented. In 1987, I believe, there were plenty of limited series. So this story certainly could have been a limited series. But the idea that for 2 full months, all 3 of the Spider-Man books were going to be turned over to you, Mike Zeck, and the rest of the creative team, was that always the plan, or did somebody see, extra limited series as an option?
No, it wasn't the plan in the beginning. Mike Zeck and I got hired to be the new team on Spectacular Spider-Man. And then I pitched this story, which is the long story, which I'd been nursing for at least 5 years in different forms with different characters till we got to Spider-Man.
Well, let me sidetrack you for a second, because I want to make sure it's true. Did you originally pitch this, at least a version of this concept, as a Wonder Man story, and then later as a Batman story?
Yes, this is very true.
Okay,
very true. It started as a Wonder Man story, which people I think laugh at that because why Wonder Man? But I don't know if you remember, there was Wonder Man and the Grim Reaper, and Wonder Man had the ability, I think, to regenerate. So I thought, first of all, a story about 2 brothers who love each other and hate each other at the same time, kind of what I later did with Peter and Harry. There's a lot of emotional dynamic there. And then I thought, what if the Grim Reaper actually kills Wonder Man, buries him alive, and then he comes out of the grave? And my original idea was like 6 months later, and I pitched it to Tom DeFalco, my old friend, who happily, thank God, rejected it, because what I've seen over the years is that, I have my intentions for the story, and the story has its own intentions on where it needs to go and what its final form is going to be and when it's going to go out in the world. So as much as I try to control it, I have no control. But I like this idea of the hero in the grave and coming back from the grave. So I pitched it as a Batman graphic novel. That got rejected by Denny O'Neil. So I got rejected by the best. He rejected it not because he didn't like the story, but because this is so early. This is when DC was just starting to do graphic novels, and I pitched it as a graphic. And Denny's answer was, "We already have our graphic novel for the year."
Oh wow!
So it's like, all right. I went away for like a year, and I came back, and then Len Wein, another great editor and a good friend, was editing the Batman books. And I had a whole sub-Joker story going on in there, which was just when they started developing the Killing Joke, and he thought there were similarities between my story and what they were developing with the Killing Joke. So I got rejected again. So that's 3 rejections by 3 really great editors, But that's the freelance life, It doesn't matter how successful you are, in quotes, there's always rejection, and you always have to bounce back and find a way through. So when I got offered the Spider-Man gig, I thought, here's my chance to do this story. And of course, it was the perfect place to do the story. All the elements came together. Originally, I had a different villain in mind. I had created a new villain. And I pitched it with this new villain. And don't ask me about the villain, because I've completely forgotten anything about him. I have no idea who he was or what he was, other than it was vaguely sort of a Marvel version of Hugo Strange, that kind of thing. But I was literally.
By the way, you'll probably remember who the character was when all of a sudden there's like a 6-part Disney Plus series on the character you pitched, 40 years ago. Like, oh yeah, that guy.
He was never published, so they can't get him.
Okay.
So I was literally sitting in my office one day, and this is before the internet. So you needed to do other things to waste time instead of working. And I was flipping through a Marvel Universe handbook, and I came across Kraven. This is literally how it happened. Kraven was a character that I never gave a second thought. I actually thought he was a pretty stupid villain. This guy in leopard skin pedal pushers chasing people around trying to shoot them.
AKA Christian on a Wednesday night.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for.
Well, we've all done it, right?
The 80s were a weird time.
So anyway, I see where this conversation's going. So I came across the entry on Kraven, but there was this one line, and I don't know whether it was ever in a story, if they just made it up for the Marvel Universe handbook, that Kraven was Russian. I'm a huge Dostoevsky fan. And something clicked in my brain like instantly, and I went, oh, I understand this guy and I know who he is. And I called, the first editor on the book was Jim Owsley. I called him up and I said, who you know is Christopher Priest. I said, forget that villain I was pitching. We're going to use Kraven. He was like, but I like the other villain. I said, no, I have this idea. I want to use Kraven. So we threw the other guy out. I used Kraven because Zek and I were working together, and we had worked together on Captain America. And I knew I needed a third character to kind of contrast Kraven's version of Spider-Man and Peter's version of Spider-Man. So I pulled out Vermin, who was a character that we had created when we were doing Captain America. And then all these pieces just came together. The fact that Peter had just married Mary Jane gave an emotional urgency to the story that wouldn't have been there had they not been just married. The fact that he was in the black costume, it would have worked with the other costume, but the black costume so suited the story. So all these things came together, and Mike and I had such a good relationship working on Captain America that by the time we were working on Spider-Man together, it was almost intuitive. It was just, we were just clicking. And then Owsley left and Jim Salicrup came in. And Jim was the guy that said, and no one had ever done this before, he said, well, you can't have Spider-Man buried alive and we think he's dead in Spectacular Spider-Man while he's fighting Dr. Octopus in Amazing Spider-Man. It's going to ruin the reality of the story. Right. So why don't we run it through all the Spider-Man books for 2 months? So that's what ended up happening. That was Jim's idea, and I give him all the credit for that. It was a brilliant idea, and everybody's been imitating it ever since.
That's true. I've seen that happen many times.
Yeah.
And I think the decision, let's start with Web of Spider-Man, our newest book that my assumption would be maybe not the most popular, from a business standpoint. I think it makes sense because it certainly helps. And, you're talking about Kraven's background, and that's a perfect example of me as an 11-year-old, just stuff over my head. I mean, you're referencing, his father fleeing the Tsar and, just sort of, all the historical elements of it. And I was just like, hey, Spider-Man's not on this page. Where is he? So, it's an interesting thing you said about the handbook of the Marvel Universe, because I used to get all those when they came out, and you would read things. You're like, oh, I had no idea. But also at that point, you couldn't, do what you do now, which is, let me go to my computer and read 100 issues that this character appeared in and find a reference. Right. So that's fairly interesting. And I agree with you, by the way, that to me, Kraven was always kind of goofy. By that point, Marvel Tales had sort of reprinted, starting with Stan and Steve Ditko's earliest Amazing Spider-Man. So, I'd recently seen him and I'm like, all right, I guess, he definitely seemed a little goofy.
Not in this.
Not in this. And one question before we dive into the story itself, there are elements that I'm surprised appeared in a major, from one of the big two in the 80s, which include Kraven with the shotgun. I think it's very clear, we just see the silhouette, but also the fact that, Vermin grabs this lady, and then the next time we see him, he's just, picking some bones clean. Were there elements of okay, we know what this story is, but there's things we can't show, these are for 11-year-olds in Greenwood Lake, New York. You can't necessarily show some of the more graphic elements.
The only note, this is the amazing thing when I look back on this story, the only note that I remember us getting, the only note of any substance, maybe the only note, was there was one panel with Vermin with a lot of bones, and Jim Shooter said, "Could you have a few less bones in that panel?"
Okay.
And that was it. It was one of those occasions where basically how I wrote the story, how Mike drew the story, that's the story that you got in print. There was no pushback. And I look back now and I go, wow, this was at the time as dark a Spider-Man story, as adult a Spider-Man story as it had ever been done. But you're not thinking that when you're writing it. You're just writing a story. You're following the characters, you're following the story, and you're writing from your heart. And it's only later that you can look back and see what the story really was.
Well, and I think also too that what you imply, it's such a brilliant use of like what you also don't show. There's one panel where Vermin pulls that woman into the gutter, and you just see "yum" as the one word, and that is as unsettling as any image you could have concocted.
Well, I think it's always to indicate something is 90% of the time more impactful than showing it. I grew up on the Twilight Zone, and you watch those old Twilight Zones, and a lot of that is shadow and suggestion. One of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes was the one with Billy Mummy wishing people out into the cornfield, right?
Right, yeah.
And there's a scene where he turns this guy into a jack-in-the-box. Well, if you really watch the scene, you see a close-up of the guy's face for a second with the little goof, and what you really see is just a shadow on the wall. That shadow is a lot scarier than if they'd had CGI and could make a man into a jack-in-the-box. The shadow scares the hell out of you.
Yeah, I mean, that's literally why the X-Files worked as well as it did, because it was, one of the darkest shows on, I mean, visually, and it was like they were the first one to really use the flashlights everywhere.
Yeah, that's right.
Every cop show took it over, and you were like, oh yeah, I don't know what they're looking for because we haven't seen it. And the unseen, that's a great point, is always so much scarier, really. As revealed sometimes in movies where, finally you see the alien or the monster and you go, oh no, where did the budget go?
Put it back in the shadows.
Yeah,
well, it's like Spielberg with Jaws. He didn't have such a great shark, so you just saw bits and pieces of the shark, and it was a lot more effective that way.
Right, absolutely. So you're talking about the era that these stories were published in, and again, for me personally, it's the sweet spot. I loved Peter and Mary Jane getting married. I was very excited about it, and the black costume. I mean, he was wearing the black costume. The first issue I ever bought was Amazing 254, and I got Peter Parker 89. So it's really like right when that happened. I didn't get the really valuable issues that I should have bagged and boarded, but I was 11. They wouldn't have been worth anything anyway, but I move on. And just reading it again this week, I'm like, oh, wow, this is so new. She's like, oh, I got to pack up stuff from my apartment so we can move in together. I'm like, oh, this is that point, before they even move into the fancy.
And it even may be that when we first started working on it, because we took our time working on it, because for it to run in all those books, we had to have everything pretty much done.
Right.
It may be that, and I can't swear to it, when we started, they weren't even married yet. And then it became, oh, wait, they're going to be married. This is a great element to add to the story. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And
so much of the whole thing of him coming out of the grave for his love of Mary Jane. Well, it would have worked if it was his girlfriend, but it works 1,000 times better when it's his wife that he just married.
Right. No, absolutely. Go ahead, Mary.
I had a question, and I know he mentions like it seemed like it was the recent death of Ned, and I don't recall where exactly in the timeline Ned's death was
correct. This is the moment in time where it had just been revealed like 5 months earlier that Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin, which got retconned into him being the Hobgoblin and then retconned out. There's I've more read a lot about it, that he was never the person who was supposed to be, so they figured out a way that he wasn't. But yeah, Ned Leeds was I believe he worked at the Daily Bugle. And
Ned Leeds was someone from the early, Lee Ditko issues. He's been around forever.
I think he ends up married to Betty Brant, or possibly they're just dating or something. But
something like that,
right? And again, these are issues I haven't reread in almost 40 years, but I have a sense for that. So so I thought that tying it into that continuity, it definitely takes you back in a way, because Ned Leeds is obviously not who people think of. People who see the movies and the animated, there's that Ned character in the Tom Holland movies. There's people who think of him, but this guy wasn't as cuddly, at least not
No.
when we thought he was the
No, even in the
hobgoblin.
early Lee Ditko days, they were more rivals because in
Yeah.
the beginning they were both after Betty. You know,
But well, it's a different Peter. That's what's interesting too. It's like this is not the Peter who's cracking jokes left and right. Like this is one who, like basically page one, he's feeling it. Like he's
yeah,
the idea of him being human and what the pain that comes with being human. And I thought that was really an interesting angle into this world. And I'd say anyone reading this, by the way, the forward was terrific. As far as I felt like I'm glad I read that because it got me in that right mindset for what was to follow in terms of this isn't the usual, Spider-Man who, slings a web and a joke at the same time. This is one who really was feeling the pain of his destiny and his fate.
yeah. And I always say that the advantage to the story, which was a disadvantage to me, was that I was writing that at a very rough point in my life. And although I wasn't doing it consciously, I was channeling my own pain through these characters. And that's one of the reasons why I think the story still resonates and has an emotional authenticity, because it was real. That was what was going into it. It was my own struggles. In some way, I was all of those characters. You know what I mean? I was Peter trying to come back from the grave looking for love. I was Kraven losing his mind. I was Vermin down in the sewers. They were all, every character in every story is an aspect of our own psyches anyway as writers. But in that particular story, I was really channeling a lot of what I was going through. Again, I wasn't doing it consciously. I can look back now and see it.
Well, I think that now that you say that, one of the things that I really enjoyed, it sort of puts it into even more perspective, is that they're sort of, the I don't know, the little narrator boxes. I actually don't know what they call them. Sorry, but they change colors and we're
captions.
Yeah, right. So it's not the thought balloons; it's just the captions.
Oh yeah,
right,
yeah.
exactly.
And there's a lot of first-person narrative.
Yeah, and they change colors depending on who's saying it, and
even the font is a little different too.
Right.
Yeah.
To get in at a time where changing the font wasn't as simple as like, all right, I'm hitting this button and now the font changes. You've got to get guys like Tom Orzechowski to like, all right, now put it at a slant. Great, thanks. And
yeah, Rick Parker was the letter I have to give. Letterers are so incredibly important, and they are often ignored.
Yeah,
and as a writer, I always say that lettering is a delivery system for my story. And I have seen bad lettering take a good story and drag it down, and I've seen great lettering actually lift a story up, because the reader's not conscious of it, and they shouldn't be. But that's, it's coming into your eye. And if there's something a little clunky in that lettering, the story starts to feel clunky. People don't realize it, but it's really important.
Right. And that's actually why I shouted out Tom Orzechowski, because he's basically, I don't know a lot of letterers that would have signed up to write that much Chris Claremont dialogue and narration. I've talked to Claremont about it, and he, it's just the fact that it's like, can you get a little smaller, and you're right, though. It's interesting because I don't read a ton of modern comics, but you will notice the things that aren't great. Sometimes they have these great covers, and they have 8 variant great covers, but then no one took the time. And I'm not talking about anything in specific, but just general. Sometimes then you open it up and you go, oh, wow, this looks like trash, but the cover was so pretty. And I think at this time, obviously, maybe that's the difference, having the handwritten words and all that. But getting back to this story, I just thought really getting the point of view of Mary Jane in particular, because obviously we usually get a lot of thought balloons from Peter in the comic, and we also get the perspective of Kraven. But Mary Jane obviously was always in a certain era, she would have been called a tough broad, and so when the guys are hooting and hollering her in the alley, she just smarts off to them. And then that look on her face when she thinks Peter has shown up to save her, and then Kraven just bludgeons those guys, and she's like, oh my God,
and she knows instantly, this is not my husband.
Yeah, and I thought that was great too, right? Because so many times when you have these kind of stories, someone's putting on someone else's mask or costume, it strains our credibility in terms of how long we believe someone couldn't tell. But within like one moment of him appearing to break that guy's neck, she's immediately like, that is not Peter.
Right.
And it's a great moment. I like that also Mary Jane she was worried about him, but she was never like hysterical. She was deeply concerned, but even she didn't spill the beans on who he was. Like she still
Yeah.
was really measured, very three-dimensional in her response.
She's a great character. I love writing that relationship. There was a talk about her being strong. I did a story later when I was writing Spectacular Spider-Man in the 90s, where the chameleon somehow shows up at their house and she beats the crap out of him with a baseball bat, you know? And Peter comes home and he's like, "You beat the chameleon? Oh, that's incredible," you know?
Yeah. She's like, yeah, I didn't beat up the Hulk, but the chameleon I can take out. And yeah, I think that's it is very interesting because you read this and they dated off and on for at least our passage of time, decades, but they'd been together at this point for a while, but the marriage was new. And then she's sort of, her internal monologue is what you imagine that the spouse of a police officer or firefighter is. Every time you go out you don't go out that door. Every time he swings out that window, that could be the last time I see him.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think that's why she's not hysterical, because she's like, this is really what I signed up for. One of my favorite scenes that I completely didn't remember is she shows up in the middle of the night at Robbie's house, and you can see she wants to tell him.
Yes.
And she's like, I can't. I just, it's like, yes, he's a friend. It's not like telling J. Jonah Jameson, but I can't do this. And the fact that she just leaves without even saying what it is, I just, sometimes it's those little scenes where, if you wrote a one sentence summary, nothing happens in that scene, but that scene's so important, I think, to really let us know.
And it's, it's always been suggested, or at least I always felt, that Robbie always knew more than he was saying. That was always the feeling. And that's maybe why she was drawn to go to him in the first place, because some part of her kind of knew that maybe he knew,
Right. Yeah, exactly. It could be one of those. Yeah, I know that at least in one point in continuity, they had a moment where, when Aunt May died long before she was brought back and then died again, she was like, I always knew you were Spider-Man. And it's like, oh, you wrote that?
Yes.
I'm sorry. So you wrote Amazing 400. And I remember seeing it. And so my first thought was, no, she didn't. And then you have to think about it for a second. It's like, how could she not?
Right.
Okay, up through Amazing Spider-Man 50, she probably had no idea. But there's a point where you're like, oh yeah, he disappears. He gets great pictures of that Spider-Man fellow, and boy, he's got broken ribs a lot. He
and
falls
the
down a
timing
lot.
with headlines always seems to be in check too. So
yeah,
right.
Yes.
But she could never fully admit it to herself. That was the thing. It was too traumatic for her to think about, for a number of reasons. Her nephew out doing that stuff, and then Spider-Man was always identified with Uncle Ben's death. So there was a lot of stuff there for her.
Yeah, and a lot of that sort of stuff comes up for Peter in this, sort of as he's about to crawl out of the grave, and just sort of coming to terms with his life and the decisions he's made, and it for a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man who is fun-loving and kind of freewheeling with the quips. Man, he has a lot of darkness, I mean, Gwen Stacy, Captain Stacy. I mean, his first appearance, Uncle Ben, and it's like, if you'd budged and put your elbow up, that guy wouldn't have gotten away. Just the fact that it's like, that's on you, and seeing him deal with it, I think it's good when that's not all the character is, when they're always but that's why it's more impactful, at least for me, when you visit, he's got this occasion where he has to think about it. And the Kraven mindset, going into this, I think one of my favorite things is he's like, I just want, the spider, but he wants Spider-Man to know, I could kill you, but I want to bring you back so that I can show you that I was able to beat Vermin when you needed Captain America's help. What do you think about that?
Right. His whole thing is, I don't have to kill you. I've just proved that I'm better than you. After all these years, finally, I've proved that I'm better than you.
So I'm better than you, and I'm a better Spider-Man than you, too, which I thought was interesting.
Yes, exactly. Well. In his mind, and he's so wrong, he's completely wrong.
Yeah. Was there anything, it seemed like you didn't get a lot of notes. So maybe this is just your decision. It seems to me that it's important that you deal with, in these 6 issues at the end, the Kraven confession, so that it clears Spider-Man's name, so that it's not like, the next month, all right, everybody still thinks he's this. Was that important to you to kind of I mean, Spider-Man's not beloved thanks to guys like J. Jonah Jameson, but to have had that be the impression of him, that he was basically, like Batman, I think would have damaged a lot of the situations where he's trying to, rescue someone
I
or
think
help
my
out.
memory is, and again, this is a long time ago, so I'm giving you
Sure.
these answers. This is what I was thinking. I don't know if this is what I was
We'll
thinking.
believe you.
I
We'll
hope
believe
this
you.
is what I was thinking. Right. And then someone will keep repeating this and this will become gospel, But I think it was more a character beat for Kraven, because in his own warped way, he respected Spider-Man. He proved his point. So here's my confession. He's out of the picture now,
And one of the great things is that you have is before Kraven kills himself, he just realizes that when he's like, well, you need to kill Vermin, he's like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And regardless, I'm not going to do that. He's like, so he's not just a term, I'm using air quotes. He's not just a good guy. He really is a good guy. Like, he can't do that. Peter
Right.
doesn't have that in him. And I sort of found that to be fascinating. Now, Eric, you shared some images, some great Mike Zeck images that we have here. And this one in particular for our visual audience is fairly early in the story. I love this look of Kraven, when he's first taking in all of his potions and he's, basically telling us, the reader, his plan. And I think that, highlighting that, but really just the full swing we get, from that moment at the beginning to the Kraven that we're seeing now, that, he knows he's getting ready because he's going to die, and I mean, even in 1987, if his father fled the Tsar, he would be fairly old. So it would make sense that, this is sort of
right. And the
Kraven's
suggestion
last
to the
time.
readers is that it's maybe because he's old and worn out, but he knows that he's going to die by his own hand.
Right.
He knows
Yeah.
that from the beginning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that it's it's great to sort of go through it. Now, Eric, I was sort of talking about the first time that I read this, but I actually haven't asked you off.
Let me ask you before that, because you said
Yeah.
you were 11 years old, and I know people
Yeah.
come to me at conventions. I was 8. My mother bought it for me. I'm like, oh my God, did this like traumatize you in any way? Did it freak you out? Did
it freaked me out in the way that I knew, I'm like, oh, this is really different. And the shot, if I was really good at preparing ahead of time, I'd have that silhouette of the shotgun. But that moment where I'm like, oh, wait, I know what's happening here. I'm that old, whereas I don't know, if I'd been a little bit younger, I would just be like, okay, it's raining. But so, yeah, I wouldn't say it is one of those things that when it was going through, I couldn't believe it. I mean, look, that at the end of the first issue, Spider-Man's not dead. At least you don't think so. But you're like, all right, well, how does this go? And then we don't see him again until the end of part 3, I think. And it's just like, oh, wow, he's really not around for a while. And I think that the fact that there were stakes of this level, I think that some of the Vermin stuff was lost on me as a kid, because that was the thing that struck me, because I've read it a few times, but reading it again this week, I was like, oh yeah, like I don't think I thought about him actually eating the people, even though they call him like a cannibal. So it definitely, I mean, it stands out. I mean, there are, I've been doing various iterations of Marvel shows for a while, and a lot of times for like a co-host birthday would come around, I would buy them a trade paperback of this, because I'm like, if you don't know this Spider-Man story, I think you have to read it. And I think even though it's so tied into that continuity at that point, I think everybody should really read it. And so that's sort of a meandering answer, is that it was impactful, but I wasn't horrified,
good.
It's not like, it's not like watching, Rambo or something, you know what I mean? So it's like, I think that stuff would be more called into question, and I think we were maybe already, a few Stallone or Schwarzenegger movies deep in this era. So I think that just to have that sort of intensity visited upon the specific Spider-Man corner of the Marvel Universe, I can't think of anything that came before that compares to this in tone. I mean, there's just moments, like I was talking earlier with you both about the horrible things that have happened in Peter Parker's life. And I don't think it was for years that I realized that he actually kills Gwen Stacy in trying to save her, because he shoots the web, and cracks her spine or whatever, or breaks her neck. And I was just like, oh, I just thought he wasn't in time as a kid, you know? So it's such a, you know, I think that, and that's of course Jerry Conway. I think that so many people have the greats, at least the ones that I remember, have that deft touch of like, this isn't going to freak out kids, but when you're a grown up, you're going to have to put it down and be like, oh my God, I can't believe
But
that
that darkness has always been a part of the character since his origin. I mean, look at what is his origin. I mean, really. And that's the great thing, you know, with these great iconic characters. The wonderful thing is you can sort of, as long as you're true to the essence of the character, you can bend them and twist them in a lot of different ways. You can do a completely lighthearted, goofy Spider-Man story. It's absolutely appropriate. And you can do something like this, and it's absolutely appropriate as long as it feels like it's authentically Peter Parker. And that's the other important thing about Spider-Man. It's not Spider-Man. Mask on, mask off. This is the adventures of Peter Parker.
Right. Yeah, no, and it's you know, in that era, the spectacular title had the long title of Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, and I always like that distinction, you know, because it's like, yeah, let's not forget that that's the guy. So Eric, when have you read this before, and how long had it been? I wanted to kind of have you share your thoughts reading it, you know, this week compared to any time you'd read it before.
Yeah, I'm a little older than Christian, so like I would have read this as it happened. And I think it was interesting too, because like the difference, you were 11, I think I was 12 going on 13 during this run. So right around the time of my bar mitzvah. So becoming a man in the eyes of the Jewish law.
Did you have a Kraven themed bar mitzvah, Eric?
Oh, who didn't?
He hunted all the guests, right?
Of course. He hunted them down to be like, hey, this envelope's a little light. What's going on?
Don't bring this envelope twice. Yeah, it was. You know, I think what's interesting about returning to these titles. So many of these themes, you're right. Like, I don't think this didn't traumatize me. And on your list of traumatic 80s properties, let's not forget Revenge of the Nerds, which might have been more traumatic than all of them in terms of weird adult content, which we all saw and read. And I don't know how I saw some of the movies I saw in the theater or on HBO, but this comic, I don't recall it traumatizing me. I do remember, though, the idea of like what the black costume represented, and truly the sort of, I don't know if I would have known the word duality necessarily at that point, but the idea of like the duality of Peter Parker. I mean, that's one thing you're bringing up so interesting about Peter Parker is there's so much to him as a character that, I mean, even taking us over to the MCU for 1 second, like the fact that you could have 3 Peter Parkers in a movie and it didn't feel crowded. Rather, it made complete sense to have the 3 Spider-Men, because it is so many different sides to Peter Parker. And really the mortality here, that's one thing about what you're saying, Christian, is so on about reading this at this age. You know, by the way, as my son's about to get bar mitzvahed in a month, you know, everything comes back to Kraven and my bar mitzvah. It definitely resonates in a way that as a kid, you know, there was one level of this I would have gotten, and I was reasonably, I think, you know, smart as a 12-year-old, but I wouldn't have felt it in the way I felt it reading it now.
And you know, that's true of anything that we read at different points in our lives. Even if the first time you read something, you're 21, you know, you return to that novel when you're 35 or when you're 45, you're always going to find, you hope, if it's a good piece of work, that you will always find something different, something new and enlightening in the corners of that story.
Yeah, well, and the idea of them feeling their age, that's definitely something, as I get right down the road from 50, you know, like that comes up a lot. And so that was the thing about reading this specific title, that it's like I don't pick up Kraven's Last Hunt thinking I'm going to really relate to every character in there as much as I did, including Vermin. And yet that's the real strength of the storytelling here is they're all so immensely really. Oh, there's my frame.
Well, yeah, I forgot that you had actually sent it to me. So
I love it, and I read this late at night too. So
that lady being pulled into the manhole cover and just the yum, is. But yeah, look, I think you said it, JM, that you know, I think we've all got a little vermin in us at times. You know, there's that feeling of like, no, I can't go out there, I can't, you know, and I don't remember a lot of usage of that character, and I find him so fascinating.
Yeah,
in
I used
here.
him a lot because I created him, with Zach,
Right.
but I don't know if many other people have used him over the years.
Yeah.
Later, when I was writing Spectacular Spider-Man in the 90s, we did a lot with him that really, really explored not just him as Vermin, but the man that he was before he turned into Vermin, and really did a deep dive into his psyche.
Oh, yeah, I'll have to dig that up. One of the sort of enduring things about this story, though, is that you definitely have that feeling when it's over that yes, he goes back to being Spider-Man, although the the next month is like a story where he ends up in an insane asylum. So it wasn't right back to Anna Senti wrote that. It wasn't right back. I'd kind of forgotten that was what was next, and I was like, oh yeah, can we go have some fun? At some point, and
I think it was like, look what he got away with. Let me do one of those weird stories,
right, yeah, exactly. And
I see you're Kraven, and I raised you.
Right,
in
that's
asylum.
right. That's right.
Yeah, so this is all right before the David Michelinie pairing with Todd McFarlane. I mean, we're literally months away from that, and it's sort of like, it was a, I don't know, it was such a big, flashy time, and I think a lot of people remember those stories. And I mean, I loved them when I was a kid. I have I have no bad memories of them, but it was just like these stories like this stick with me a lot more than a lot of that other stuff. I mean, X-Men #1 is the Jim Lee one, is the best-selling comic of all time, but I would have to look up and tell you what happened in it. But I can tell you all about the episode where the issue where Colossus broke up with Kitty. I mean, they're the things that the characters matter so much to you, especially when you're young and impressionable.
Right.
One thing I wanted to touch on, I want to talk to you about other things. You sort of recently revisited the themes, and I have the screen there in this Kraven's Spider-Man: The Lost Hunt. So it's not actually with Kraven, and I'll have to find an image of it to share. That's a more recent story, and it's from a very specific moment in continuity that I will be fully honest. I had tapped out of Spider-Man for a while at this point when Ben Reilly became Spider-Man. But this idea that Peter and Mary Jane had retreated to Oregon, and he was like, she was teaching theater in a high school, and he was like working at a college. And I think that the most common thread from Kraven's Last Hunt is just Peter's doubt and guilt at times, and how that's able to be sort of utilized against him. Talk a little bit about the idea of, revisiting this story, but the importance of the fact that, Kraven's not in it, I mean, and
Kraven
honestly,
hovers over it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
He literally hovers over the image, and I honestly couldn't tell you if Kraven has been revived at any point. I like to hope he wasn't, but I figure
it took them a while. Everybody comes back. I think it took them 20 years before they brought him back, and I think he's dead again, and then they cloned him or something like that.
Oh yeah, like it's almost like the clone is the way out. It's like if it's just like, oh, this is a clone of Kraven, it's like, oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, no, it's funny to think that Jean Grey was only dead for 5 years of real world time, and it was like,
I think it's pretty good that Kraven stayed dead for a good couple of decades there.
Yeah.
In terms of Lost Hunt, it was very interesting to explore that particular pocket. Thank you. Collected edition on sale now. And again, we talk about Mary Jane. To me, the roots of that for a lot of it is just that relationship between the two of them. That's the anchor for this whole story, The Lost Hunt. And then there was a character. One of the things I wanted to explore with Kraven was, well, how did this guy become Kraven? I mean, he was this kid, booted out of Russia during the revolution. Where's the link between that kid and this guy running around in the jungle? And I'd had this other character in the back of my head. Her name is Asia Arisha, kind of marinating back there for a couple of years. And when I was talking to Marvel about this story, I thought, oh, I can use her here. And she's a great new character, and B, she's going to fill in all the blanks on Kraven, and we can understand him even more while we can explore this part of Peter's life, which I never had written before, when they were out in Oregon, and he had no powers. So he's being attacked by Gregor, who is a disciple of Kraven's, essentially, and he's got no powers. So the theme for Peter is, well, what is Spider-Man? Is he the webs? Is he the superpowers? Is he the clinging to the walls? Or is he Peter Parker's character as a human being? And that, of course, is who he is.
Yeah, and I think the fact that this is an era where he doesn't have his powers, it really allows for sort of the exploration of who he is, just sort of similarly, the number of years where Storm didn't have her powers in the X-Men, characters who lose powers but ultimately get them back. I mean, there's a number of those sort of things where you really get to know them, and I think that there's not a lot of times, there's times where Peter's just beat up and he's not able to operate at full strength, but to have this be Mary Jane's pregnant and just the very specific nature of the story, I knew that it had that this had come out, and because I was going to talk to you, I wanted to grab it and take a look. And I just thought it was fascinating the way that it explored the same issues, their relationship, Peter's own inner demons, really, and yet it didn't do. And Kraven's not dead anymore, So I think that to be able to tell it in that way. One of the things
I just want to say one of the things that I enjoyed exploring there was the fact that now that Peter has no powers, now that he's left Spider-Man behind, he's able to kind of, as often happens in life, we're in the middle of something, we're not processing it. We step away from it and we suddenly realize whatever that thing was that just happened to you. Oh my God, I was in a car accident, or I fell off a roof, or whatever the thing is. And in the moment, you can't even deal with the trauma of what's happening to you. This is a guy who, when he was like 15 years old, became Spider-Man, and spent years going up against crazies, against total psychopaths again. And, while he was in it, he couldn't deal with it. And now that it's done, he's suddenly beginning to realize what he'd been through. The trauma that being Spider-Man caused him, always doing it for the right reasons because, that's who Peter is. But I really enjoyed getting into that corner, which I think had never been explored, which is like, holy crap, what was I doing all those years? I could have died on any given day,
Yeah, no, the idea that as long as you continue running forward as Spider-Man, you don't think about it, but to basically you get quote unquote home, and you can't go out and do it. So it's really like dealing, obviously with the soldiers with PTSD and
yes, exactly right.
And that's very much who he is. The transition, mentioning soldiers, I do want to touch very briefly on something that has been announced on DC's production slate. Someone, when they found out you were going to be on, they wanted me to talk to you at least briefly about Creature Commandos. And I went and dug up. I did a free subscription to DC Universe Infinite, I think it's called, and I read some of the earliest stories, and I think it's a fun idea, the Creature Commandos, which I want to ask you about. But there was one story that I was just like, I can't imagine turning into an editor and having them even let someone pencil it. There's a story where the Creature Commandos end up in a town in Germany. This is obviously all in World War II. And they're these kids who have been brainwashed to, they're doing everything for Hitler, and they've been given super strength. And one of the kids beats his mom to death, and the other kids all chime in. And I'm like, oh my God, you want to talk about stories that would have traumatized me if I'd read it as a kid? And I'm like, I can't imagine like saying to an editor at DC or Marvel, it's like, can the kids beat the mom up? Is that okay?
It's so funny. I'll relate it to Kraven too. It took me years to like look back and realize, oh, Kraven is a horror story. I didn't realize when I was like, this basically it's a superhero horror story. And Creature Commandos was something I cooked up literally at the very beginning of my career. I was just starting out. Yeah. I was working with Len Wein, a wonderful editor, and he wanted a series for Weird War Tales. And I'd already had this story that I was going to pitch. The book was called Weird War Tales. So I thought, okay, weird war, monsters fighting World War II, and that was as deep as it really went, and I did the first 6, I think half a dozen issues. And it was the very beginning of my career. This is 100 million years ago. And I forgot about it. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, here we are all these years later. And, James Gunn is doing this series, which has evolved from the version that I did, but it's still based on it, And it's like, you just never know these days what's going to come around again, what's going to pop up, what obscure character that you created is going to show up in a movie or a TV show. It's so I'm delighted. Let them do it. I'm happy to do it. James Gunn is really, really good guy. He really loves comics. He took the time a couple of months ago. We sat down on Zoom. We had a really nice chat together. Just a great guy. I have great faith in what he's going to do with the whole DC universe.
And I think that's so apparent with everything he does. Obviously, Guardians of the Galaxy, but then also like, yes, the Suicide Squad, but that Peacemaker series, just the sort of you can tell when somebody loves comics and when somebody's like, oh, that'll be interesting, And I think one doesn't necessarily mean success versus the other. Like a great example, I don't know that Christopher Nolan loves comic books in any way, but he had a great take on Batman that obviously worked really well. And then James Gunn, it's a lot different, And I think,
and he likes these obscure corners and these weirdo characters, from left field. So that's why I think he was drawn to Creature Commandos.
Yeah, and I guess that's the hope with these characters too. Over the lifeline of them, it's like you then get people who are in a position to get these stories made and made the right way, basically, and who really the material speaks to. And I think that's one thing. With the various superhero movies and shows, you could see the ones where maybe the showrunners or the head writers, the directors, really are fans and have a real appreciation. Like I was even thinking he was a horror director, but Scott Derrickson's take on Doctor Strange I thought was really
great example.
And it became this like surprisingly moving story about faith. And I think that's the hope, right? Is like you do get a James Gunn who's going to come and do Peacemaker better than anyone could have done Peacemaker, because he really had his own connection to the material too.
No one else probably would have even thought of doing Peacemaker. And that's the great thing. That's where his sensibility comes in. And the other great thing, you'll see him on social media just hyping some comic that he read that he liked, or, they announced Creature Commandos and all of a sudden it's back in print. That means more royalties for us. It all works out very nicely in the end.
Yes. It's sort of what you're talking about obscure characters. And it's surprising. I was thinking about this in the latest Spider-Verse movie. I think Bill Mantlo created the Spot, but the idea that the Spot is not just in that movie, but he's like the major.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I always say the truth of the matter is there's no such thing as a second or third tier character. You get the right approach with that character. And that's why I always like working with, quote, second and third tier characters. When Giffen and I did Justice League, most of what we had were second and third tier characters. That gave us the freedom to make them our own and do interesting things with them. Whereas if you're doing Batman and Superman, they're looking over your shoulder telling you what you can't do.
Right. Yeah, no, I can imagine. And I was, relieved to hear, but sort of what you were talking about the freedom you had doing this Spider-Man story. I'm a little bit surprised, in a good way, where that they weren't like, no, Spider-Man doesn't do this. He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't.
Well, the 80s, I tell you, the 80s were an amazing time in comics, both in terms of creator-owned comics, because that's when I started doing my own creator-owned stuff, and even the mainstream stuff. There was just a lot of freedom to play and experiment and push the boundaries of the form. I don't think if I had done Kraven, if I had pitched it, 20 years later, maybe I could have done it, but I don't think I could have done it in the way that I did it then. And certainly not the way where it basically came out without a comet changed.
Right. No, I mean, and that's fascinating. And then, sort of the era that sort of follows this is the one where it turns into like, yeah, but can we get Wolverine in there? Or how about Venom? When they start to go like, hey, wouldn't it make sense for Ghost Rider to show up? It's like, no, actually it wouldn't. But
well, I think also, if we had done it another time, it would have been, well, can this be like a 3-year arc? You know what I mean? So it was great that we got to get in, do it in 6 issues and get out. And it's a complete story. So and I really appreciate the fact that there are people still discovering this story now. Coming up to me and going, I just read that last week. Man, it was great, because it's self-contained. You don't need a lot of information to go into the story. Maybe you want to look up who Ned Leeds was, but it's not going to affect your reading of the story if you don't look up who Ned Leeds was. So I like that. I like that it's when you're working on something, no one's thinking, oh, this is a story that will last for decades. You're just working on the next gig, and you're doing the best job that you can possibly do. And especially in those days, they were just starting to reprint things in hardcovers and all this stuff. On to the next gig and move on. So the fact that we're all these years later, This book is continually being reprinted. People are rediscovering. You want to talk about this story from 1987? It's deeply gratifying to me, you know.
And I imagine the movie is going to bring even more eyes onto this title.
The Kraven movie, yeah.
The Kraven movie with Aaron Taylor Johnson, which was supposed to come out in October, but you know, that's sort of the interesting thing that happens with Sony. You know, the Madam Web movie's coming out in less than a month. They continue to tell Spider-Man stories without Spider-Man. And, you know, I think with mixed results, to be honest, you know, I mean, I think Morbius wasn't well received in general. People liked the first Venom, you know, and it's cool to see these characters, but in some cases they work best when they interact with Spider-Man, you know, and but I think you know, time will tell. I mean, I think obviously Kraven, as evidenced by Kraven's Last Hunt, there's plenty of time before he even knows about Spider-Man. So you know, we can see what kind of story they tell with this. In terms of a variety of stories, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the DeMultiverse, which let
me say one thing before we move on to that, if I can,
please,
because the one thing we didn't talk about is such an important element, which is the art, which is Mike Zeck. And Bob McLeod, whose beautiful inking over Mike was phenomenal. Mike Zeck is an impeccable storyteller. And, you know, when you're writing comics, especially, well, not even especially, when you're writing comics, you don't, sometimes, especially on monthly books, you don't know what you're going to get. And with Mike, you always know that you are going to get impeccable storytelling. You know, sometimes you'll see comics where especially if you're working Marvel style, you write a detailed plot first, they draw the story, you get the art back, and then you dialogue. Well, say Kraven leaps, you know, the character leaps from roof to roof, he stumbles, he falls off the roof. It sounds like a simple thing, but some guy might draw that in such a way that you have to then add this balloon that says, oh, I just stumbled and fell off the roof, because the art did not deliver that. Mike, every single thing you ask for is so clear. Look at Kraven's face behind you. All the emotions, all the surface emotions are completely clear. He is as good an artist as ever worked in this business. So when I got that artwork back, I don't have to explain anything that's going on in the pictures. And that's why that story is filled with first-person narration. It's all in Peter's head and Mary Jane's head. If someone else had drawn that story, I might have had to spend half the time explaining other things, writing it in a very different way. So, you know, Mike's contribution is incalculable to the success of this book. And then Bob McLeod with the beautiful inking, and again Rick Parker, who had a real challenge with the lettering. And everybody, to make a comic book work, every single element, the coloring, everything has to work. I've seen it. I write a great story, someone else does some really great art, you put them together, and the chemistry is not there. So you need people that are delivering their best, and you need that chemical reaction between the creators. And it's not always there. And we were lucky. It was there. And you can't make that happen.
No, I mean, and Mike Zeck is, you know, certainly one of those, you know, greats that, you know, doesn't get mentioned, you know, when you start going down a list. He doesn't come up as early in that list as maybe he should. I mean, that Punisher miniseries from a few years before this is still the definitive. I've read a lot of Frank Castle stories, but that's what I think of, the way that looked. And obviously, you know, they had him do Secret Wars, you know, I mean, so, so it's, I think I can certainly understand what you're saying, you know, and especially sometimes when you go and reread some of these things, and some fill-in artists are great. Like I think Rick Leonardi's style is very unique and specific. And then you'll see others who you're just like, oh, who is this? This is somebody who, you know, got a tryout. And, you know, it's, I think that when the whole team's working together, obviously that's when we get the best stuff. You know, that's why people will talk about, you know, eras like, you know, just to go back to X-Men, people talk about Claremont and Byrne, you know, and like that's the era that you usually hear about. People talking about
because they had that chemistry.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you know, you don't even have to have a personal chemistry with someone. Happily, Mike and I really got along as well. But there's a chemistry that just happens on the page. You know, and sometimes you start to work with somebody and I don't know how it's happening, but it's just there. And someone else, it's just not there. Just the same way it is with people. You meet somebody, you connect, you meet someone else. It's like you're shooting arrows over each other's heads, you know?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The battery.
I've known Eric. I've known Eric for years, and I'm still trying to
You
make it
just
work
can't
for us.
connect. I know.
We can't
I
even
know.
talk right now. What were you going to say, Eric?
I was just saying it's your battery mate in baseball, right? You pitcher and the catcher, and I think also here too, when you bring up the art, I there's so many different styles within these 6 issues. I mean, you have some of it's really grounded, some moments are hyper realistic, some moments are hyper gothic, and then
Yeah.
you have these like the idea of the afterlife. One of my favorite panels was one where it's almost like Peter looks like a little embryo in a sea of white.
White. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I thought
I
that was such
remember
a
that. Yeah.
bold choice, and one that is so markedly different from a lot of the rest of the comic. And then moments like this, pure horror,
Yeah,
where
just
he's licking the officer.
the lady reminds him of his mom, so he doesn't eat her. But at the same time, he also licks her
Yeah,
face.
that
But
was
the
like,
image this is the one I was trying to
Yeah.
get.
yeah,
This
And so
image of
now
Peter.
all that's in the plot, right? But give
Yeah.
that to 5 different artists. You'll get 5
Yeah.
different versions of that back, and you're going to get the very, very best version and more from Mike. And then the great thing about writing plot first is then you get the artwork, and sometimes in your head there's a sequence you think you're going to have to write a lot, and you get the artwork back and you realize it's all there. I could put 2 words on that page, you know? So it's this wonderful chemical interaction when you're reacting to the artwork. My plots are very detailed. There's a lot of information in there. There's dialogue, but I love getting that art and responding to it. I also love writing full script too. You know, I'm working on a project now, it's full script, but there's some magic in working in that style when you you react to the artwork before you do your final script.
well,
Yeah.
actually, Christian, if you could go back to the last one too,
where he's crawling,
Crawling out,
for our
but-
audio audience.
Yeah.
Peter in the suit is crawling out of the grave,
Yeah.
and it says, "I love you." Obviously, he's thinking about Mary Jane. Yeah.
in the middle of a lightning strike too, like
Yeah.
it's just such a, there's so much happening in this one image, and
Yeah.
so much story, as you were saying there before.
Yeah. Well, I do want to make sure that we get a chance to talk about the multiverse, and I figure instead of me trying to summarize it and saying, did I get it right? Why don't you talk about sort of these 4 projects and the creators that you collaborated with on?
Right. I'll try to keep it brief. So I've been thinking for years about doing a Kickstarter because I love the idea that you're going right to your audience. You know what I mean? It's
Sure.
like there's no wall between you and the audience. You just bring the material right to them. And long story short, I was talking to a friend, David Baldy, who has a long history in television as a writer and a producer. And one of the reasons I didn't want to do a Kickstarter was it's too much work. You know, it's a lot of work. And David said, I'll do it with you. We'll be business partners on this, and we'll do it together. He said, what ideas do you have? And I pitched him a bunch of ideas, and thinking we'd take one and we do a 4-issue miniseries and kickstart that. He said, that was David's idea. Let's do all of them. Let's do 4 different #1 issues. So that's what we did toward the end of 2022. We launched Layla in the Lands of After. Thank you for putting it up there so I can remember everything. with Sean McManus, who I've worked with before, one of my all-time favorite artists. Any Man with David Baldy on, who I've worked with on a Spider-Man project. Godsend with Matthew Dow Smith, and Wisdom with Tom Mandrake. Tom was an artist who I'd wanted to work with for years. And each one is in a different genre, different tone, different style. So we did a Kickstarter, and it was very successful. And the idea was they'll vote for which title they like the best, and that's the one that we'd complete the miniseries. But we also gave them the option to vote for all of them. And when the votes were tallied, what got the most votes was please continue all of them. So hopefully within probably the next 2 or 3 months, we will be launching the Multiverse Phase 2 with the second chapters of all these books. We're all working on them now. We're getting all the artwork in. I've written 90% of the scripts. And it's been one of the most exciting and gratifying projects I've ever been involved in. It's really, really fun. But like I said, they're all different. Layla is sort of an all ages Oz-like fantasy about the afterlife. Any Man is closest to a superhero story. Godsend is sort of like Kirby Gods meets Philip K. Dick. Wisdom is a supernatural Western. So they're all very different.
And I guess the easiest way to go is your website, DeMatteis, DeMatteis.com.
Yes.
And look, I even said that with my glasses off. That's
great. That's great. Let me plug 2 more things.
Yes, please do.
We go. So the past couple of years, I've written a couple of novellas. The first one is called The Excavator. Came out in 2022, and the most recent one is called The Witness. Came out last September. They're stories I'm really, really proud of. You can get them on Amazon. It's prose, but they're illustrated. So like The Witness has 10 beautiful illustrations by J.H. Williams III, who's one of the best artists working in comics these days. The Excavator had 10 illustrations by a wonderful illustrator named Vasilis Godzilis. So I want to direct some people to my prose work as well. It's been really great working in prose again, which I've done over the years, but this is the first time in a while and I'm working on a third one right now. So those are the, and also coming up in April, a new Spider-Man miniseries, Shadow of the Green Goblin, and a bunch of other stuff that I can't talk about yet.
Is Shadow of the Green Goblin something that's current continuity, or
it's as early in continuity as we can possibly get. He's been Spider-Man for maybe 3 weeks.
Oh, I love that.
About 3 weeks after Uncle Ben's death.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah.
So that's
but it's a deep dive into the Osborn family and that dysfunctional stew, and Peter and Aunt May still dealing with the grief of Uncle Ben's death and not really dealing with it, and I'm having a lot of fun with it.
Oh, that sounds great. And just take a quick moment, because I know from your website that you do these workshops. Just take a moment and explain what that's like.
Right. I haven't, unfortunately, I haven't done the workshop in a while. I did a couple online during COVID, but I was doing these 3-day writing workshops called Imagination 101, and I brought them online. And hopefully within the next year or so, I will get back to that. But the other thing I do is I have something called Creation Point Story Consultation, where I work with folks one-on-one. So if you have a comic book series you want to work on, or a screenplay or a novel, people come to me and we get on Zoom or Skype or whatever, and we work on it. So I'll sit down with someone from the initial idea through the completion of their 4-issue miniseries, developing and working with them on that, or their screenplay or their book or whatever it is. And it's really, with the workshop and with this, as I'm teaching, I'm learning, because everyone you work with, you're learning something from, because you're watching their process. It's really, really gratifying. So if anyone's got an idea, something that they've been wanting to finally get out into the world, if you go to my website, you'll see the information about Creation Point. And the next time we do a workshop, that'll be on my website as well.
Great. Yeah, no, and I'm sure it's satisfying when, somebody that you've worked with, at least, even if it's just like, oh, I got a positive letter back from a publisher, there's some interest. One of the great success stories is that obviously people who know Spider-Man and Marvel, they know the artist Mark Bagley. What I remember is that he was the winner of the Marvel tryout book.
That's right.
And just, and you hear about some other artists, just showing up with portfolios at conventions, and whoever it is that they approach, whether it be an editor or a writer, is just like, oh, this is too good to not, use. So yeah, taking
and the
that
flip side of that is there's a lot of rejection. I have a drawer full of my old rejection letters that I still have saved, because that's part of the process as well, because every rejection teaches you, and I always say success in the arts, it's talent, but it's also will. You have to be able to deal with rejection, and you have to be open to criticism. So you need a thick skin and a hard head. But if you have that along with your talent, you will be able to succeed. There are people that have a lot of talent, but the minute you give them a critique, they're going to run screaming. They can't handle it,
Well,
go ahead.
Well, Eric teaches screenwriting, so
okay.
I'm sure he can't relate to that at all.
And the rejection never ends. It doesn't matter how successful someone is. Yeah. Like you saw, what I told you the story of how many times I had to pitch this idea before it finally took shape as Kraven. I've had stories that I've worked on and pitched and went away with and came back for 20 years before they finally came out. And other stories, you pitch them and they buy it that afternoon. You never know. But if you don't have a thick skin, you're not going to make it out in the freelance trenches. You're just not, no matter how talented you are.
Yeah, I don't remember where I came across it while I was preparing for today's conversation, but I think it was on your website. Maybe you posted like a screenshot. You had a rejection letter from the 70s where it was basically like, I mean, you can keep trying if you want to, but this isn't really that good. I mean,
that was the first letter I got from Paul Levitz at DC Comics when I pitched him some ideas, and he shredded my stories. He criticized my typing, and he was right about everything. But he also said, feel free to submit again. So to my eyes, all I saw in giant font was feel free to submit again. You know what I mean? Someone else might have just run screaming. He hated my stories. He hated my typing, But I was like, I can submit again. I'm going to keep doing this until I sell this guy something, And it took a while, but I did.
Yeah, I think you had a different one that something you just said reminded me of. It was like, you should invest in a good typewriter. So
Oh no, I think it was get a proofreading service.
that's what it was. Yeah.
Oh, a typewriting service. You're right. Use a typewriting service. I finally figured out the typewriting thing as the years went by.
On that end too, one thing I think, get in your forward, but also what you're saying here about, it's great reading the forward because there's so much optimism within it amidst the rejection, saying, and I did this and I was really proud, and they said no, and I did this and I was proud, and they said no. But this idea that the story almost like found where it needed to go.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
I loved how you talked about the story like it's almost like
an
its own
entity
character.
in and of itself.
Yeah,
it really, really is. And what I've learned over the years, the process of writing, and it applies to music, it applies to any art, I think, it's trusting your unconscious and trusting the process. The story itself is part of that process. And often your unconscious knows a lot more than you do. And you have to, I learned early on, sometimes you think you're hitting a wall, it's writer's block. It says, it's not. Take a breath, walk away, let your unconscious work this out. And all of a sudden, there's a movie playing in my head with the solution to the story,
Yeah, no, it's great to think about all of it. And yeah, there's nothing better than rejection letters from people who went on to do well. You don't want the collection of rejection letters for,
right. And credit to Paul Levitz for taking the time to even read the stuff in the first place and say, feel free to submit again, to give me feedback. A lot of people, I've seen it over the years, you encounter people, you give them the feedback and you realize they don't want feedback. They want you to tell them that their story is great as it is.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. You have to be open. If my feeling when I started out was like, tell me, tear it apart. It's okay. I want to learn. And the only way I'm going to learn is if you tell me what I'm doing wrong.
Well, JM DeMatteis, obviously.com, and you're also on social media. People can interact with you there. I really appreciate you taking the time. And honestly, it gave me an excuse to reread Kraven's Last Hunt. So, there's no complaints from me there. And obviously check out everything that you have going on. And I'm very intrigued in that Green Goblin story. Quick note for our audience. Next month, we will be back talking about Echo, the saga of Maya Lopez, which is, I know very little about that character. The first time I saw her, she was on the Hawkeye TV series. And on our other show, Marvel Movie Talk, we did just cover the 5-episode drop of the series. So it seemed like a great time to explore the comic book version, who my understanding is that at some point ends up with the Phoenix Force, but this is way before that. So you'll see that next time. Thanks again to everyone who was watching. Thanks again to JM, and we will see you next month.